On behalf of the Harry Burgess Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at UW-T, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first installment of what will be a monthly seminar series for the remainder of the academic year. And it is an absolute honor to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Toni Gilpin, who's a labor historian, a labor educator, a writer, and an activist. Toni is most recently the author of The Long Deep Grudge, a story of big capital, radical labor, and class war in the American Heartland, which was published almost exactly a year ago by Haymarket Books. She's also the co-author of On Strike for Respect, the Clerical and Technical Workers' Strike at Yale University, 1984 and 85, which was published back in 1994 by the University of Illinois Press. But her work has also appeared in Jacobin, Labor Notes, In These Times, the salaciously titled Naked Capitalism, and we should mention that Toni was also the recipient of the 2018 Deborah Bernhardt Labor Journalism Award. So Toni's joining us this evening from Evanston, Illinois, to discuss The Long Deep Grudge, which I honestly cannot recommend enough. It is truly a fantastic book. I think it's a history that really speaks to the larger evolution and the contours of the labor movement as a whole. As such, it doesn't shy away from addressing, the injustices and the exploitation visited upon workers in pursuit of profit, but it also highlights the historical role that solidarity's played in the fight for workers' rights against injustice and exploitation. And I think what was most interesting to me is it really sort of centers the role of civil rights unionism in advancing the national conversation surrounding desegregation. The Long Deep Grudge explores the intertwined histories of International Harvester and the United Farm Equipment Workers of America. But in so doing, it actually weaves together a history that links the Haymarket martyrs to the victims of neoliberalism's creative destruction. But not only is this an analysis long and deep, it's also very personal. I think, it deals with the relationships that were forged on the factory floors, the picket lines, and of course, occasionally holding cells, right? It is, as Toni explains in her book's final line, not to give a spoiler out here, I think it's a story about love, it's a story about fellowship, and of course, it is a story about solidarity, which is why it is, again, my absolute pleasure to welcome Toni Gilpin to our seminar this evening. I'd also like to welcome everyone else who took time out of their day to Zoom in for this live broadcast. I know it is a totally insignificant and in no way distracting day in American history. So I do appreciate you all taking time out of your day to Zoom in here. As I was putting together this lineup of speakers for winter and spring, I reached out to some folks for recommendations of people who we should get involved. And Toni's name came up repeatedly in this book, which I hadn't read until, really December. I dove into it, absolutely adored it. This is, I think, work that demands to be shared. And, having read it, I just completely agree. So please join me in giving Dr. Toni Gilpin a warm round of digital applause. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your time and your experience and your expertise.
Thank you, Alex. I think you can hear me now. It's really wonderful to be here, and I am so thrilled by Alex's introduction. It's almost as though he has summarized the book so well, I barely need to talk about it, but I guess I'm required to do that. And also, I do want to thank everybody for being here. Obviously, this is a pretty extraordinary day in American history, and whatever else, we can all kind of breathe a sigh of relief that Donald Trump has exited Washington, D.C. It's also nice to be here on the same week that we've commemorated Martin Luther King's birthday, since I think my book does speak to much of what the civil rights movement is about. So I'm gonna, before I get into talking about my actual book though, I wanna step back even further than that, since in this present moment, with all that needs attending to right now, it seems incumbent upon historians to explain, especially for working people, I think, the oppressed, those most besieged by our current round of crises, why understanding the past matters. Offering up that cliche that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it isn't really sufficient, I don't think. In fact, for working people, there is much in the past that would be quite valuable to repeat. But those truths have been largely erased from the versions of history favorable to elites and perpetuated by the institutions they've created. And I am going to just bring up some slides now, so hang on. Okay, I hope you can all see that. So we're all good with seeing that, right? I just want to make sure before I proceed. I once did a Zoom call, got halfway through it and realized no one had seen anything I was pointing at the entire time. Early labor historian Selig Perlman, writing in the 1920s, described capitalism as not simply an economic and political arrangement where one class owns the means of production. It is also, he said, a social organization presided over by a class with an effective will to power. Essential to that effective will to power is control over the historical narrative, the kinds of assertions about who has built America that we see in this particular slide. So essential to that is that historical narrative, and that means defining, controlling what is defined as progress that equates with a society controlled by and catering to the 1%, such that it becomes difficult to imagine that any other reality is or ever has been possible. For capitalism to thrive, it must erase traditions, undermine communities, and obliterate the people's history. That's because progress for working people has been achieved not by individualism and self-interest. Material conditions have improved not because of employer generosity or charity from on high. Rather, things have gotten better when workers, through solidarity and communal effort, have effectively asserted their own will to power. Truly understanding history, then, is for working people in itself an act of defiance and resistance, and is also integral to the essential task of organizing for a more equitable future. So that's my case for reading labor history and why it's important, especially in discouraging times. And, of course, I wouldn't mind if you begin that journey with my book. Now, a quick description of this book that Alex kind of provided, or a bad description that would be the opposite of what Alex did, could be that it's about a smallish, long defunct union, the Farm Equipment Workers, known as FE, and its dealings with a company that went out of business decades ago. But that does not do much to sell the book. So I think I'm going to try to pique your interest more, and I apologize to those who may have already read the book in full, but I'm going to read a little bit from the book's introduction entitled Undried Blood on the Pavement. A Black man murdered in the pre-dawn darkness on a South Side street. In 1952 Chicago, the rule was that such an event didn't matter much, not downtown anyhow. Reporters wouldn't be dispatched to cover it. The police would take their time investigating it, and in corporate suites, the death would have passed without notice. But this particular killing got plenty of attention. The victim was 52-year-old William Foster, an employee in the malleable iron foundry at the sprawling McCormick Works complex, the cradle of corporate behemoth International Harvester. He'd been a few blocks from his home, heading to work early on a mild October morning, when he met up with someone who struck him on the head and fractured his skull. Foster died a short time later without identifying who had attacked him. He left behind a wife and 2 children. No witnesses came forward, at least not right away. The police, the press, and executives at International Harvester, however, were immediately certain where the guilty party could be found. Captain George Barnes, head of the Chicago Police Department's notorious labor detail, had no doubts about the motive for the assault. This was obviously a labor slugging, he promptly declared, because the Farm Equipment Workers Union was in the midst of a bitter strike against International Harvester, and Foster had chosen to cross the FE's picket lines. Within hours of Foster's death, International Harvester offered a $10,000 reward for the arrest of his assailant. This company will make every effort to safeguard every employee who comes to work. This crime must not go unpunished, said the Harvester president in a statement publicized across the country. Then the Chicago Tribune weighed in. There is good reason to believe that the Foster murder was communist inspired. The union at the particular harvester plant where he is employed is the Farm Equipment Workers Union, which was kicked out of the CIO because it is controlled by communists. Now you're going to have to read all the way to the end of the book to find out what happens all the way to the end of it, as you said, because in fact, while the book opens with that 1952 incident, the story then goes back in time and only returns to that big violent strike and just what happened as a result of that killing toward the end. In between, the book details the story of International Harvester, also called IH frequently, one of America's founding industrial empires that was once the fourth largest corporation in the world, with a reputation for anti-union animus that stretched back to the 19th century and that went on in the 20th century to pioneer sophisticated union avoidance tactics that remain standard business practice today. And it details how the FE, which was from its founding in the 1930s connected to the Communist Party, managed to organize the uber powerful Harvester Corporation and built an exceptionally militant, solidified, and effective union. But how is it that I came to tell this story? And Alex alluded to this a bit. I talk about this in the preface of my book as well. As it turns out, this is in fact a bit of a family as well as a labor history. When I was growing up in Chicago in the 1960s and 70s, my father was an official with the United Auto Workers back when the UAW was just about at its height with nearly 1.5 million members. So that's the world I remember. And in this slide, this is a UAW-led march in downtown Chicago. On this next to the man in the tie, next to the sign there is my dad. This is probably 1973, I think, maybe 74. And that little inset, the little arrow, that's me marching in the parade as well. So this is how I spent a lot of my childhood and young adulthood in these kind of UAW-related activities. And though my father didn't talk about it a lot, I knew that he had been a member of the Communist Party earlier in his life. And I was also dimly aware that he'd been in the leadership of the union that first organized the many agricultural implement plants in the Midwest, the FE, which had been absorbed by the UAW in 1955. I knew that my dad held the FE in high regard, though since it had ceased to exist before I was born, I never really asked him very much about it. My father died in 1979 while I was in college, and shortly after that, I decided to start poking into the FE's history. What I discovered proved important enough, I thought, to propel me to go to graduate school and write a dissertation about the FE. But I put all that aside. After I finished grad school, I didn't pursue a full-time academic career. I moved back to Chicago. I did teaching of various kinds, engaged in political work, and I raised 2 daughters. But back in about 2012, as union membership figures continued to plummet and the labor movement grew ever weaker, even with a Democratic administration in Washington, I began to think again about what I had learned earlier about the FE. The cooperative ethos that increasingly defined the labor movement after World War II had been vociferously challenged by the FE. The philosophy of our union, one FE official said, is that management has no right to exist. And it seemed to me that the FE's alternative ideology would be relevant to those trying to figure out how to revitalize and redirect union organizing today. So that's why I decided to write this book, which is quite different than the more academic dissertation I produced decades ago. And I'm hoping that that's what makes it readable. As Alex said, I wanted to produce a book that would engage readers of all kinds. So I included many individual stories, not just my father's, but those of other union leaders and rank and file workers and corporate titans and jazz musicians, politicians, civil rights crusaders, all sorts of folks. And through this story of the conflict between International Harvester and the FE, I wanted to show how the fights we're engaged in today connect to battles that were waged a long time back. And in light of what I said at the outset of this talk, I sought to underscore how obscuring those past victories and just how they came about serves to undermine working class power in the present. I believe I can make the case there is no better example of that deep-rooted struggle in American history, at any rate, than in the bitter battle between this particular company and union. That's because the origins of this grudge match can be traced far back. During the massive nationwide general strike for the 8-hour day that began on May 1st, 1886, police violence outside McCormick Works in Chicago, the very same plant that was in the excerpt I read from in my book's intro, prompted a demonstration a few days later in Haymarket Square. Young Cyrus McCormick II proved instrumental in ensuring that a group of anarchist labor activists were arrested and hung for the bombing that took place there that night, though to this day, no one knows who was really responsible for it. This proved a catastrophe for the American labor movement, as in the national crackdown following what came to be called the Haymarket Riot, the 8-hour day movement collapsed, unions were decimated, and radical workers' movements were utterly destroyed. Nonetheless, anarchist leader August Spies at his trial vowed, "If you think that by hanging us, you can stamp out the labor movement, then hang us. Here you will tread upon a spark, but there and there, behind you and in front of you and everywhere, flames blaze up. It is a subterranean fire. You cannot put it out. The ground is on fire upon which you stand." Indeed, the title of my book is a reference to the legacy of Haymarket, as the Chicago author Nelson Algren wrote in 1951 of the dark grudge cast by the four standing at the gallows head for the hope of the 8-hour day, and of the long, deep grudge born for McCormick, the Reaper. The McCormick name was and still is ubiquitous in Chicago, and by the early 20th century, their business had morphed into the International Harvester Corporation. Since IH had been out of business for some time, I should emphasize that it was one of the preeminent businesses of the world, employing hundreds of thousands in factories, mines, and mills across the globe. The heart of their far-flung enterprise remained in the Midwest, including the Mammoth, McCormick, and Tractor Works complex located on Chicago's near west side. When the Great Depression hit and a new upsurge in organizing, the industrial unionism of the CIO challenged America's corporate giants, it's a notable but little known fact that International Harvester held out longest against that tide. By this point, Harvester had moved beyond simple repression to embrace more sophisticated forms of union avoidance as the company became a leader in what was dubbed welfare capitalism, introducing a host of programs that were designed to control as much as they were to reward. Harvester also created the first corporate industrial relations department, and as part of that had introduced company unions to its plants all the way back in 1919. Coal miner and CIO founder John L. Lewis called organizing International Harvester the hardest job I know of, and he knew a little bit about taking on tough opponents. Though the FE gained recognition at Tractor Works in 1938, it took until mid-1942, so after US Steel, Republic Steel, General Motors, General Electric, and even the notoriously anti-union Ford Motor Company, for Fowler McCormick, grandson of both Cyrus McCormick I and John D. Rockefeller to sign a multi-plant contract with a CIO union, the FE. So it took over half a century for those subterranean embers to really catch fire for the workers at International Harvester. And as I emphasize in my book, the FE's example makes clear that the CIO upsurge of the 1930s was not entirely as spontaneous as is often represented. The union breakthrough at Harvester was the culmination of a slow but steady organizing campaign stretching decades back. And once the FE gained recognition, union fervor at Harvester would burn quite intensely. It was at least a bit ironic then that famously anti-union IH ended up obliged to deal with the FE, an organization led by Communist Party associated radicals who were dedicated to keeping harvester workers as agitated as possible. Such a perspective stood in sharp contrast to the trade union ideology embraced by the non-communist labor establishment following World War II. Walter Reuther, who became president of the UAW in 1946, was the most forceful and eloquent of these labor statesmen. Reuther championed what's been called the politics of productivity, which held that an expanding economy with cooperatively achieved ever-increasing production levels could benefit everyone, management, workers, and consumers alike. The 1950 UAW General Motors Treaty of Detroit was the most famous exemplar of this philosophy, a 5-year contract introducing cost of living and productivity pay increases, in other words, rewards for increased output, along with good benefits for GM workers, but which also obliged the union to partner with management to ensure efficient and uninterrupted production. As a result, the contract also included stiff no-strike clauses, which required union officials to condemn and curtail any walkouts that took place while the contract was in effect. Moreover, the 5-year agreement provided for a relatively small number of stewards and committeemen, those union representatives who are the first responders, so to speak, when workers have disputes with management on the job. The Treaty of Detroit was widely heralded in the establishment press, but the class-conscious FE leadership, imbued with a Marxist belief that profits spring from the inherently exploitative appropriation of surplus value, held a contrary view. FE leaders insisted that a cooperative framework belies the fact that there is only one side for business, its side, and that it operates on the principle of getting as much as it can. It can be deterred in its exploitation only by applying economic and political pressure 365 days a year. What did this mean in practice? It meant that FE leaders nurtured their grudge against International Harvester and more specifically the McCormicks who controlled it, calling them out for their greed, and not incidentally making regular reference to the Haymarket martyrs and the McCormick's culpability in their deaths. But beyond the tough talk, FE leaders also pursued collective bargaining objectives that were the polar opposite of those contained in the Treaty of Detroit. The FE opposed long contracts, preferring 1-year agreements, as they saw value in the agitation attendant to negotiations. They opposed cost of living and productivity pay increases, believing that they limited what workers were entitled to. They resisted no-strike clauses and embraced a large and aggressive steward body committed to resolving workers' grievances immediately. The vast majority of those grievances centered around management's efforts to get employees to work harder and faster. But FE leaders, national and local, felt under no obligation to assist this drive to increase productivity. The FE's combative, rank-and-file centered ideology had a measurable impact within the workplace. In the 9-year period from 1946 to 1954, at the dozen or so International Harvester plants represented by the FE, there were over 1,000 work stoppages. That's an astronomical figure, representing walkout rates during the period that far surpassed those at other plants, including those at the UAW's plants, for instance. And just to put this into a contemporary context, in the most recent 9-year period for which we have recent statistics from 2011 to 2019, among the 160 million workers in the entire United States, we had only about 140 strikes in total during that entire 9-year period. The 30,000 FE members at IH plants were stopping work at least that much each year, and sometimes, as in 1950, when they walked out 177 times, much more often. Such conduct made harvester management apoplectic. The company wants good relations with responsible unions, harvester officials intoned in 1947. But FE leaders, so Harvester declared, are irresponsible radicals who are more interested in disruption than in labor management peace. Privately, FE leaders may not have disagreed with that assessment. But as far as they were concerned, there was a practical reason for all this disruption. Through it, workers got what they deserved, and promptly. As one local FE leader put it, if something happened to a worker today and we walk out, his case will be settled in the morning. Every walkout, every time we walked out, it got results. So the FE's militancy distinguished it in the post-World War II era, but there was another factor that did as well. Farm equipment factories were located mostly in the American Heartland, some in Chicago, but others in smaller towns in more rural places. As a result, the FE's membership was about 80% white. Nonetheless, the FE, as a result, in large part because of its connection to the Communist Party, maintained a top-to-bottom commitment to interracial unionism. How was this manifested? From its founding, the FE's executive board always included at least one African American, and from 1946 on, the FE had both a Black executive board member and a Black vice president. This sort of representation was then unheard of. Unions with far larger percentages of African American membership, like the UAW, the Steelworkers, the United Electrical Workers, had no Blacks in their top leadership posts. From its founding, as opposed to many other unions like the UAW, the FE fought for and won contract terms like plant-wide seniority that were most likely to benefit African Americans. And one main focus of my book, as Alex, I think, mentioned, is the FE's extraordinary local in Louisville, Kentucky. In 1946, Harvester opened a plant in Louisville, hoping, as so many other companies did, to take advantage of the low-wage, non-union South. Harvester hired some Blacks for production jobs, which was unusual in then segregated Louisville. The workforce, though, was about 85% white, and many of those white employees, some of whom had only recently left rural Kentucky, came into the plant reflecting generations of animosity towards African Americans. One Black worker at the plant who became a leader of the Louisville FE described the workforce this way. We had hillbillies, that's all we had, farmers, guys who wore overalls. And those kind of guys were racist. I mean, real racists. Nonetheless, in its organizing drive at the plant, when it was competing against several other unions, the FE, in contrast to those unions also seeking recognition, made it clear that the union itself would be fully integrated and committed to fighting for Blacks as well as whites on the job. Given this message and what is sometimes said today about the intrinsic racism among the deplorables, it was therefore rather astonishing that the FE won the 1947 representation election. Even more remarkably, the FE local then immediately challenged Harvester on the lower wage scale, what was called the Southern differential it had planned to introduce in Louisville. After a strike that lasted over 40 days, Harvester relented and raised wages for all workers in the plant. The Southern differential strike underscored for Harvester workers in Louisville the FE's message that only through solidarity could Black and white workers get what they all truly deserved. But this wasn't the end of the story, for after that strike, the FE continued the very hard work of combating racism in the shop and in the larger community. Civil rights activist Ann Braden, who worked with the FE in Louisville, indicated that the FE carried out a constant campaign to convince the white workers that only by solidarity of the Negro and white workers could the union be strong. And just what exactly that all entailed is going to require you to read the book. But to me, among the more moving aspects of the story that I tell about the FE in Louisville are the personal accounts from white workers who detail their struggles to overcome their own racist heritage, and Black workers who talk about what such interracial unity meant for them. Okay, so these seem like an impressive set of accomplishments, but they were tenuous ones, achieved by the left-wing FE in the period when the Cold War was underway and red-baiting attacks on communists were escalating daily. So the FE found itself beset by powerful enemies, including International Harvester, the reactionary press, and the government. The non-communist affidavit provision of the Taft-Hartley Act caused several FE leaders, including A.J. Martin, the FE's young African-American vice president, to resign rather than concur with the Act's requirement to denounce the Communist Party. FE leaders, local and national, were harassed by the FBI and local Red Squads. Yet perhaps the FE leadership's most bitter battle was with the labor establishment, and especially the UAW's Walter Reuther. Reuther asserted jurisdiction for the UAW over the farm equipment industry and began a series of raids on FE locals, triggering National Labor Relations Board elections at plants where the FE was already the recognized bargaining agent. The UAW was thus expending considerable resources to organize the already organized, in other words. Remarkably, however, despite the red-baiting barrage aimed at the FE by the much bigger and better funded UAW, harvester workers remained doggedly loyal to the FE, rejecting the UAW's advances and voting for the FE time and again. But despite that endorsement from workers, the UAW and the labor establishment moved to cast out those unions deemed to be communist-dominated, and the FE, along with a dozen or so other unions representing over 1 million workers, were expelled from the CIO in late 1949. At this time, the FE entered into an autonomous affiliation with the United Electrical Workers, then the third largest industrial union, and also one of the left-wing unions expelled from the CIO. The fighting on so many fronts took its toll. The battle reached a crescendo in 1952, a year of high drama for the FE. In July, International Harvester announced that it would move its twine mill, a facility that stood next to McCormick Works in Chicago, south to New Orleans. For years, we have heard International Harvester and the millionaire McCormick's boast of their responsibility to employees and the public, one FE flyer read. The truth is that Harvester's planning all too clearly includes relocation of as many plants as possible in low-wage, sweatshop, non-union, Jim Crow areas. But the FE did more than issue paper protests, as African-American Robert Ray, the president of the FE local at the twine mill, announced, "We will put up a physical fight to keep the machinery from being moved." And 250 workers, many of them Black, some of Eastern European descent, and many of them women, promptly engaged in a sit-down strike. A little over a day after the occupation began, the Chicago Police Department charged in to clear the workers out, and outside the plant, a full-scale melee developed as FE members attempted to blockade trucks bound for New Orleans, loaded up with the plant's machinery. My father was one of the dozens who were arrested during that twine mill confrontation. But that was merely a dress rehearsal for what came next, as in August 1952, the FE began its strike against International Harvester, the subject of the excerpt from the book, my book that I read earlier, which quickly became exceptionally tumultuous. Shortly after the strike began, FE leaders were hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee, an event the press and Harvester management made much of. IH kept its plants open during the walkout and made clear its intentions to get rid of the FE once and for all. And given how FE members generally responded, as these shown here in East Moline, Illinois, to those who tried to cross their picket lines, it was no surprise that the strike quickly became violent. It was in the midst of this walkout that the killing of McCormick Works employee William Foster took place, who worked at the same plant, I'll stress again, that had been at the center of the Haymarket violence. Harold Ward, also African-American and an employee at McCormick Works, but who was not a strikebreaker, but instead a local FE leader, was charged with the murder. Now, I'm not going to tell you what happened, either in terms of the strike or the murder trial, or even for the FE in general, though you can probably figure out that it didn't all end well for the FE, since the union itself no longer exists. But I have to leave some things, unsaid to encourage you to read the book. But in terms of what's important in the FE story today, to conclude, especially for activists dedicated to reviving the labor movement, and I speak, of course, to all this in my book's conclusion, but let me emphasize a few points here. With so much of the labor movement moribund today, it's appealing to look back to union militancy in previous periods, particularly the Great Depression, for inspiration, and the FE can provide a case in point. But it's also become a bit of a truism that after World War II, rank and file based militancy was quickly stifled by an increasingly bureaucratic, cooperatively minded labor leadership that bought into the politics of productivity. The FE's example, however, makes it clear that militant conduct continued for some unions through the 1940s and into the 1950s. At least Fortune magazine thought so, as in this late 1946 article, they referred to the FE's president as party-lining, class-warring Grant Oakes, shown speaking on May Day at the grave of the Haymarket martyrs. So let's recognize that one need not look too far back or to other countries to find alternative visions of a labor movement animated by a belief in class warfare rather than class collaboration. And that perspective had implications beyond a greater propensity to walk off the job. This was not simply a display of contrariness. All those many walkouts at FE plants were grounded in the radical leadership's insistence that workers' interests were served by curtailing, not augmenting, corporate profit-making. That allowed the union to combat management efforts to speed up work and put into action its principle that every worker's grievance represented a scream for justice. It also freed the FE to offer an aggressive challenge, as in the 1952 twine mill sit-down, to the notion that companies had the right to move their facilities wherever they might make easier money. The labor establishment, however, having hitched its wagon to the belief that higher corporate profits would ensure greater prosperity for all, was left slack-jawed as jobs were shipped overseas and companies squeezed more and more production out of fewer people, making a wasteland of so many working-class communities and further brutalizing the on-the-job experiences for those lucky enough to remain employed. My point is that the ideological orientation of a union leadership, and not just its toughness, matters and has both short-term and long-term consequences. We should not underestimate, however, just how rocky the going has been and will be for those unionists who adhere to the concept of class warfare. My book emphasizes the many difficult choices that faced left-wing union leaders during the Cold War period and how increasingly narrow their path forward became, in part because of the red-baiting assault on them launched by other labor officials. But make no mistake, all CIO unions, even the more conservative ones, were at best only grudgingly accepted for a brief period by the ruthless and cunning captains of American private enterprise. I centered my story around the deep-rooted grudge between International Harvester and the FE for a reason. I wanted to document just how effectively capital has exercised its will to power, and to underscore that those capitalists, not other union leaders, have been and remain the real enemy of the working class. But our class war is not over. It is ongoing, and labor has one indispensable, formidable weapon at its disposal. The FE's story and the long struggle that preceded its founding underscores that in order for workers to challenge capital, that core union tenet, solidarity, meaning all out and all encompassing solidarity, is essential. The FE's experience in Louisville demonstrates that even in supremely hostile environments, it is possible to break through racist barriers. To do so, organizers must be unwavering in their commitment to equality while managing to be both relentless and patient with workers. Maintaining solidarity requires a constant campaign, in Anne Braden's words, not an exercise that ceases once a union is established. It's not an easy task by any means, but in Louisville, the FE managed to win over even inveterate racists. And as a result, white and Black workers not only walked picket lines together, but developed deep and abiding friendships that served as the FE's source of strength. This was true elsewhere in the FE as well. African-American Frank Mingo, vice president of the Tractor Works FE local in Chicago, said that the rank and file loved that union. Solidarity lived and felt this way as a marrow deep sense of class consciousness and communal spirit that overcomes the divisions sown by capital can have mighty consequences. It certainly has before, and by recognizing that, we can fight our way past this dismal present and build a just future for working people. So that's the end of my bit of this, or at least my talk.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Join me in giving Toni another round of digital applause there. That was absolutely fantastic. And we've got time for some Q&A. I've got a number of cues myself, but I'm interested to hear what members of the audience might be thinking about this talk so far. Maybe while what we can do, at least what we've done in the past, is have people type their questions into the chat board, and then Casey will help me sort of sort through them. And I do have sort of a question to pose while you all sort of formulate your ideas. And I will try my best not to give any spoilers away. I like the in the final chapter of the book, you talk about this. You set up this contrast between the FE and their approach to organizing and what you call sort of a where's mine school of unionism, right? Where you actually suggest that by demanding more of its members, the FE was able to build a stronger union, one that its members grew to, have a deep connection to, that went beyond sort of questions of finance or workplace realities. Can you give us a sense of just kind of how that worked, or how you saw it, and how maybe that might be instructive to organizing today?
Right. I think that when I said at the end that this was a difficult struggle, and the choices that faced left-wing unions got increasingly difficult. This is one of them. I mean, the FE leadership was committed to this kind of rank and file involvement and militancy, and the walkouts being just one example. But that was also really difficult to maintain. Though I will say that kind of cohesion was what managed to make, for example, the wages at the Harvester Louisville plant higher than any other factory in the South. So you had these kind of constant struggles, but in order to make them work, if one department walked out, it was necessary that workers across the plant support that by also walking out. So you had workers who may not even have known, and this is I relate these kind of experiences in my book. May not have even known what the issue was, what the dispute was, but as soon as they heard from a union steward that somebody across the plant was having an issue with management, they would walk off their line and leave the plant if that's what they were asked to do. So they recognized that even though their stopping work for that moment might cost them in the short run, they might lose some wages that day. It was a hassle to do that. Sometimes they would be confronted by their own foreman and plant management. That doing that doing that and helping that other worker across the plant was going to ultimately mean better wages for them. But it was the act of those kinds of the practice of solidarity that taught workers the living experience of it. So to the contrast being the Treaty of Detroit, that 5-year contract that Walter Reuther negotiated, which no question about it gave workers all kinds of goodies in a package. And also that was part of Reuther's approach. Look, it's hard to have these kind of ongoing struggles with management. It's better to have this long peace where we can all get along and then we'll renegotiate something in another 5 years. But that also meant that workers then became atomized. They weren't living this kind of solidarity that they needed to see in practice to understand what it really meant. So I think that's part of what that philosophy that the FE embraced, that we have to be engaged in these constant struggles with management to really make workers understand that that's what gives them, that's what really improves their material circumstances. And as they did that together, as white and black workers in Louisville did that together, that broke down even further those racial barriers. So it was more than just a speech from a union leader. In practice, they'd be walking the picket lines together, they'd be manning the soup kitchens together, they'd be attending meetings together. And so that's what taught them that. But it was very hard. It's hard to maintain that. And it's certainly hard to maintain that in a labor movement that's fractured and in which you have half of the labor movement attacking the other half for that very kind of activity. So I think I answered a bit of your question. I might have gone off topic. And I see Zach Patton has joined us, who is a member of one of the only surviving unions from the CIO expulsions, the International Longshoremen Workers Union. I don't know if Zach wants to add anything about expressing solidarity on the job as a daily practice, because he actually does that every day in his union. I don't know where he is. I can't see him on my little board, but I see his name. Where are you, Zach? Maybe he's checked in and left.
No, I'm right here.
Oh, you
I
are?
don't want to take
Okay.
up any time talking about my union. I was already in Alex's class with Peter Cole a couple weeks ago. So,
Okay.
Alex, you can share the recording of that where I talk about just that, actually. But
And I put you on the spot by making you talk. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I've already roped Zach into coming in to help me out here before. But yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I just recently reread with my Intro to Labor Studies students, E.P. Thompson's introduction, where he talks about class consciousness and it being, about sort of an evolving relationship. It's something you sort of, class is something you do through those relationships. It's not, being part of a union and expressing solidarity isn't just about sort of paying your dues, right? It's actually work. But in exchange for that work, you have that sort of deeper connection to the organization. Excellent. I see we've got a hand up. We got a couple hands up. Could you all do me a favor and just type the questions into the chat room if that's possible? Just to kind of keep it, only because I can only see so many people on my Zoom screen right now. And maybe while we've got people typing in questions, I did have a question about, really, I was surprised to hear it. I was hoping Dr. Luther Adams would zoom in for this, because I know you use some of his scholarship on Kentucky sort of organizing down there, just how important a role the union organizing in the late 40s and early 50s played in kind of, seeding and setting up sort of the infrastructure that would then later be used throughout the 50s during the civil rights movement. It seems like there's, through the Henry Wallace's Progressive Party, which, obviously was not a success, but it sort of provided the groundwork to put people, to get wheels in motion. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about that? I'm sure people in the audience would be interested to hear.
Right. And certainly my book is not the first or only book by any means to talk about how union organizing in the South in the 30s, in the 40s, and 50s was laying the groundwork for what would become the civil rights movement that we tend to associate with the later 1950s and 1960s. So many of the people who become the ground troops for the civil rights movement in the South were people who learned their organizing lessons and learned how to build community coalitions and interracial movements from the unions that they joined and became active in. So the FE was just one example. And one of the things I talk about in the book are which I didn't specifically talk about in earlier, was how the solidarity that they built in the shop between white and Black workers then spills over into the community in efforts to desegregate Louisville's segregated parks, its hotels, private institutions, hospitals. So the people who were at the forefront of that anti-segregation, that desegregation movement, were union members in Louisville. So, and of course, and then we read about those things snowballing and escalating and turning into the larger civil rights movement that we know, that we're more familiar with. But, time after time, if you take a closer look at these communities, you'll find union members, and especially left union members, because of the commitment that the Communist Party had to building interracial unions, to sowing those seeds for the civil rights movement. And I think you mentioned the Henry Wallace campaign, and I don't know if other people saw this. There was a picture that was circulated on Facebook and Twitter, that it was the first time I'd ever seen it, of Coretta Scott King holding a banner for Henry Wallace, because she had been a delegate to the Progressive Party convention in 1948, which was the effort by Henry Wallace, third-party effort that was widely supported by these left unions. And I explore that in detail in my book, because the FE was actually probably the union maybe the most committed and most involved in that effort. And so a lot of the African-American union members in Louisville and Chicago, elsewhere, became deeply involved in that Wallace effort, in that Henry Wallace effort in 1948. And then again, they took a lot of what they learned about the community organizing, the electoral organizing. And so it was a failed effort in terms of the number of votes that Henry Wallace got, but the kind of organizing that people were doing. And one of the leaders of the Louisville FE, Jim Wright, African-American man, talked very specifically about that in my book, that the things he learned in that campaign were what he then brought into the move to desegregate Louisville and to later civil rights struggles he was involved in. So I do think that that's critical to our understanding. I think there are a lot of good labor histories that speak to that. Mike Honey, who I know that some of you are connected to, has certainly done some of them. So for folks interested in the civil rights movement, look to the labor movement. That's where you're going to find its origins.
If I could chime in here, I'm a native of Louisville, Kentucky, and in Chicago, I was a UE shop steward. I don't know if I've mentioned that to you, Tony, but in Louisville, I was also in the IUE that represented the workers at the General Electric appliance part plant there. But one of the things that struck me about your book was that when I got active in the civil rights movement in Louisville in the early 60s, there were all these really amazing Black organizers, Sterling Neal, people like that. And I didn't know until I read your book that they came out of the FE. And that made things so much clearer to me that where they got their schooling basically and how to be active in the community came from the FE. And one of the amazing things about that local, you spoke of its efforts in desegregation. They were way ahead of their time in terms of the kinds of things they were doing. Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott came along later. These guys were desegregating parks in Louisville. They were desegregating, hotels. It was really, really amazing, and it made such a contribution to the movement in Louisville because we could build on what they had done before, then I guess one of our culminating things, and Luther Adams writes about the civil rights bill that we got in Kentucky in the early 60s. And we had a mass march on Frankfurt, 10,000 people for a state public accommodations law. Dr. King spoke at that rally. And then a bunch of crazy ass students occupied a few seats in the gallery of the legislature for a whole week, going on a hunger strike in support of this bill and to draw attention to it. But I hope everybody reads your book, and I hope people can dig up a copy of Ann Braden's book, The Wall Between, to get more information about Louisville and what was going on there. Thank you for letting me talk.
Jim and I, Jim Williams, who just spoke, we've never actually met, but we've been friends for a long time. And I was going to be going out your way to before the little virus changed plans. But those of you in Tacoma are really fortunate to have Jim in your city, and anyone interested in anything involving labor history, civil rights history, should make a beeline to, well, I guess you can't. Should Zoom call with Jim. I was going to say I could make a beeline to your house, but that would not work right now. But should look him up in one way or the other, because I keep mentioning things to Jim and he'll be sending me stuff, and it turns out he was already there and involved. But the struggle in Kentucky, I think, I want to just highlight that because we think of, when we look at Kentucky now and Mitch McConnell and its dreadful politics, this is what I was talking about at the beginning of this talk. There is a history there of people's organizing, of interracial organizing, of labor organizing, and a civil rights movement, a rich history that overcame all sorts of barriers. I mean, we're talking about when there was official segregation. We're talking about when the Ku Klux Klan was still openly operating, and unions and civil rights organizers took that on and accomplished amazing things. So for those who want to, think that Kentucky is a lost cause, or who think that Mitch McConnell represents what Kentucky is, talk to Jim and read my book, and not because I was so glad to be able to tell the stories of people like Jim Wright and Sterling Neal, these leaders down there who fought this kind of fight when it wasn't making front page news. So all of these states, whether we're talking about New York City or rural Kentucky, there's a place for these kind of conversations about interracial organizing and and Jim was there when it was a lot harder to have them. So so thanks for speaking up, Jim.
And Tony, did you want to put in a plug for the events next month, as we're sort of talking about your book and a chance to sort of get deeper into the the actual text itself?
Thank you. And if someone could conveniently put up a link, because I should have done that myself, to maybe Zach can, because Zach is part of the committee organizing this. So next month, through the DSA's Labor Committee, we're inaugurating the DSA's first labor book group. So we're going to have a sort of an in-depth discussion, or in-depth series of discussions framed around my book. So it's the 4 Sundays in February. And I invite everyone who's interested to join in. You can join all 4 of them. You can join one at a time. We're going through the book section by section. There are 4 sections to the book. So obviously the more the merrier, and it will be a good way to just delve into, with me and other activists and labor historians. We're having some labor history people join me, some union activists join me in each different session. And so we're going to really have a deep dive into the book, and not just what's specifically in my book, but the other topics that are connected to it as we go through the sections. So I'm hoping, there we go. Somebody put up, thank you, Alex. Somebody put up the link. So it's over there. And if, I'm sure if you miss it and you want to find it, you can either go to Facebook DSA labor activists, or send an email to Alex or to me, and I'm happy to give you the info. So I'd love to invite everybody to join in. And again, it's not you don't have to commit to all 4 Sundays. You can join as many as you can. You can read the book ahead of time or read it as we go, whatever. So I think that's enough of a plug. And I know we had some questions. Thanks for letting me do that.
Sure, yeah. I was I don't want to overlook the questions that were posed. We
Right,
have one
right.
About bad unions. Oh, well, yes, bad unions. So, for example, a police officers union, where unions can often act as organizations work to protect incompetent workers. The question is, do you think that some unions do more harm than good? And do you think that every industry needs a union?
Well, my belief is that every worker needs a union, and police officers unions are a different story, and I don't think that they quite compare to the other question that you're raising about, do unions sometimes do things that get bad publicity, protect workers who are less than competent, those kind of things that make the headlines, or at least get into the press. And I think, there's been a lot of agitation now against police unions from within the labor movement, and I suspect that that's an ongoing conversation, and I think there's going to be a lot of confrontation about whether or not police unions are really unions or professional associations. So that's a different that's one conversation, but then the notion that unions just kind of do, protect lazy workers or incompetent workers is certainly something that management, right now we've got an Amazon unionization drive, and that's the kind of thing that management has said and always will say. And, my feeling about for example, looking again into my research and what the FE did, what they did was resist management's efforts to make workers work harder all the time. So one of the things that drove unions, those organizing drives in the 1930s in the CIO, for instance, is that management companies would fire workers who had gotten too old to keep up with the job. There were no, before we had unions, there was no protection for any workers. So if you had been working there for 30 years, but now they were speeding up the line and you couldn't keep up, they would just fire you. And that kind of unfairness not like I want more money. It was that kind of unfairness to other workers that more often than not was what drove workers to join the CIO and demand a union. So I think when we talk about unfairness or protections, what we're talking about is unions that try to make things fair within a workplace, that give every worker an understanding of what the standards are, and that protect them from arbitrary treatment by management. So if a management wants, the boss wants to fire you because you can't keep up, you have a union that steps in to negotiate or to protect you in those arguments with management. You know, they still get to try it. And so, but you now have someone to represent you. You know, you're not an individual anymore. You're fighting against a big company. You have representation. You have, so what a union does is introduce democracy into a workplace, which is, we all watched it today, or at least many people watching it today, a celebration of democracy and constitutionalism. What unions do is democratize the balance of power. So are there time, you know, so unions will represent workers in a dispute with management. They don't always win that dispute, but there's a representation, as opposed to just allowing company officials, the bosses, to make all the decisions about who's hired, who's fired, how fast you have to work, what the standards of work are, what the wages are, what the workplace conditions are like. We could all wish now in this COVID era that workers had unions to protect them in terms of workplace safety issues. We've seen, you know, bad story after bad story in the press about unsafe conditions for workers in meat packing plants, in grocery stores, in hospitals, and those workers without union protection to step in and try to implement safety procedures are those workers who are suffering the most. So my feeling is that we're not talking about protecting bad workers. We're talking about democratizing workplaces.
Thank you, Tony. I have to leave now. I have to go to another Zoom, but thank you for your talk.
Oh, thank you very much.
So thanks, Dale. Dale's a student in my Intro to Labor Studies class. Thanks for zooming in.
That's great. Thanks.
We did have one other question, and I want to be mindful
I
of your
did
time.
see some, yeah.
I know it's
I saw some
2
questions,
hours
yeah.
later on your part of the country. A question just about sort of the dramatic decrease in direct action and strikes over the years. And the question here is,
Right.
what kind of factors do you think do you look at to explain this nearly tenfold decrease in workers' willingness to strike? And
Yeah.
I guess the question of whether or not it's the workers' willingness to strike is a good question
Right.
too.
Right. Yeah, that would be. Yeah, I would change the question a bit. And you know, we clearly know from the statistics that strike statistics have nosedived since the 1940s and 50s. So even generally, obviously, many more workers were engaging in many more strikes. The FE was a particularly extraordinary example of strike readiness or strike engagement. So I don't think we can take that decline to mean that workers have decided that everything is fine in their workplaces. What we can look at are things like which is what I talked about and talk about in more detail in the book, that one of the things that happens is this battle in the labor movement about what a union's obligation is, whether it is to defend workers or whether it's to serve as another cog that can help increase productivity, just make things make work faster and more efficient. So part of that was that a lot of unions were signing away their right to strike. So almost every union contract now has a no strike clause in it that union officials feel they're obligated to enforce. So as I said, FE officials didn't agree with those no strike clauses and didn't try to enforce them, try to avoid enforcing them. So instead, what we get are very bureaucratized grievance procedures. So anybody who's in a union now and has a complaint or an issue, they file a grievance. It, has all kinds of chains of command. It can take years to get resolved. In International Harvester, after the FE ceases to exist and the UAW takes over, you do see a big decline in walkouts, but you see an astronomical escalation of grievances. So workers still have the complaints. They're just not able to walk out anymore. And those grievances are just piling up on management desks and not getting resolved. And so workers who, for example, filed a grievance were mad because they thought that they'd been shortchanged on overtime, or they were forced to work on 2 jobs and they were only paid for 1. They wouldn't get that money that was coming to them for years if they ever got it at all. So I suspect that if we unshackled the labor movement and rank and file workers to really express what they're feeling on the job, and had the ability and the power and unions that back them up to walk out. I mean, right now, can we not believe that in COVID, with the kind of dangers that workers are facing, transit workers, grocery store workers, healthcare workers, meat packing workers, stewardesses, stewards on airlines, if they had the ability to express how unsafe they felt by walking off the job and knowing that they wouldn't just get immediately fired for it, don't we think that many of them might do that? I think that we can just presume that that's true. So I think we've got to look at labor law. We've got to look at the deindustrialization of America and how the loss of those industrial unions meant that power that was in the labor, that resided in the labor movement in industrial unions like the UAW and the steel workers and the electrical workers has declined, and with it strike figures have declined. So that's my long-winded answer. There's a lot of that in the book though, so look to that.
Well, I think so much of this nostalgia for labor's golden age involves sort of a return to what organized labor used to look like, which sort of implies, a very sort of monochromatic, white male industrial worker. And the fact of the matter is that the American labor movement has changed. It's diversified, and I think when it reemerges, it's going to look a lot different than what it looked like in the 40s and 50s. Because I mean, the nation itself looks a lot different right now.
Well, the workforce, American workers, the American working class has always been diverse, right? The labor movement, the CIO, was diverse in terms of who was coming into those unions. We had, workers of ethnicities that had never been organized before. We had more Black workers joining unions than had ever been true before. We had more women joining unions than had ever been true before in the 1930s. So that what we sort of define as diversity has changed, I think. But the American workforce is diverse, and it's also, every labor historian will make this point. In the 1930s, before we had this explosion of the CIO, those workers, those ethnic workers and Black workers and women in those giant factories, people said, labor organizers who were in the craft unions, the skilled workers unions that existed before the CIO, looked at those big factories with those workers, many of whom didn't speak English and they couldn't speak to each other, and said, you can't organize those people. Those factories are too big to organize. There are too many differences in them. So, now we think, well, the factories are easy to organize. How do we organize Google, or how do we organize Uber drivers, or how, so all of those obstacles that seem insurmountable to us maybe now, if you go back and read the literature in the 1930s, people looked at the giant factories and thought those are too hard to organize. So it can be done. It's just a different set of challenges right now, I think, that we're facing.
And they didn't even have Zoom calls and Facebook to get organized on, right?
That's good and bad, I think, and again, kind of having to do, look, organizing means having the one-on-one conversations. So, and that has to take place, and it has to take place even in COVID, and, and anybody who's on here who's an organizer knows that, and that can take place, those one-on-one conversations can take place in a variety of different ways right now, but they have to be actual conversations with a lot of listening going on, which is, again, what I talk about. There's someone asked about Amazon. I just want to throw up my hands and say I have nothing to do with the marketing of the book. But I encourage everyone to order the book actually through Haymarket Books, because not only is that better for supporting an independent press, but it's also actually less money on the Haymarket site. So you're better off doing that.
I was going to say, last time I checked, they were running a pretty sweet deal on the book. I think it was like
they're
40%
always
off.
running pretty sweet deals, actually, on almost all of their books. So I always encourage everybody to look at their full book list and get a whole bunch of books and save money, and don't use Amazon. But I think, for publishers, it's not related to my book. I just think it's very hard, obviously, as we know, to sell stuff if you don't also use the Amazon portal. The UPS question. Yeah. So Andrew, who is, I assume you're an actual UPS worker, wherever Andrew is.
I used to be. I worked there on and off for 3 years.
Uh-huh. So, can you just explain maybe what your point that you're making?
Oh, no, it was just when you were talking about grievances, that was just something that was not really a point. It was just an issue that we often had. It was just one of those things where oftentimes I remember last time I was Union 174, and I remember last time we went in there was just a little conversation where some of the loaders and certain people wanted certain privileges, but then the delivery drivers and dock loaders kind of, not like silence them, but just kind of was like, oh, you guys are just, you guys always complain about that stuff all the time. And it just got into like a really weird tizzy where like there actually was because I worked down the dock in Tacoma, down by the port, right off the port. And at the time we had at our peak employed about 1,200 employees. I remember one time in a union meeting, there was like 200 people there. And it kind of got a little heated. It got to a point where like, fingers were kind of getting pointed, and they were saying, well, you guys get treated so good, so why don't we get treated that well? And it was kind of like a weird situation. And then, yeah, we just, a lot of times, like for instance, I did a lot of them, dock, air dock, load, unload, and then I end up going to sort. And a lot of times, like I would see high turnovers in certain places, and then, you hear their complaints. But then like, for instance, out on the dock, if you worked 2.5 hours of your shift on the port, on the dock, like out in the bay, after 2.5 hours, your whole shift is double time. So there's a lot of guys who are like been there for a long time who didn't want to leave their positions because it's a good spot. And the position wouldn't really open up until one of them left. So like kind of created some weird animosity with people. I remember one time someone got a position. These two guys had been there both for about 10 years. And one of the guys got the position and the other one thought it was, he felt like he had worked a little bit harder, maybe more responsible. So then he obviously brought it to the union, and they got into a little tussle about it. And they're like, well, he was here a year longer, and he also does really good work, and they're both great guys. And then he ended up leaving UPS entirely because he just got, so emotional about that after being there for so long that he didn't get position because he thought he deserved it, kind of thing. But it was just more like when you were talking about grievances, it was just like it was like, it was just something that I experienced there. And it was just like one of the bigger things. That was one of the bigger ones. I remember one time truck loaders, if they grieve their shift, they get double time and a half for each hour they're on the dock before they get to their station. And one of the loaders is having a hard time, and he asked the guy for help, and he said, no, like we all have our own job in this organization, and don't worry, we're all getting paid. And then he ended up telling the guy I was there, like, oh, don't worry, I'll grieve it, I'll get double time, it's not a big deal. And obviously the loader can't get double time because he couldn't grieve it. So he ended up getting upset, got a little emotional, and he walked out of the trailer, and packages just started spilling into the trailer. And the guy just went, oh no, like, what am I going to do now? And the guy literally said, don't know, we all get paid, man, and flicked him off and then just walked off the floor. But they couldn't fire him, though, because they were both, union heated to 70 days. And so just sometimes I would see, like, sometimes turmoil within the union. And sometimes some people within the union felt like, well, I'm loading these heavy things, and I'm only getting $14 an hour, but you're standing there and you get $25 an hour and you get to grieve it, and then you get double time off my back. That's kind of how some people felt sometimes about it. So it was high emotions. I'd definitely say after 3 hours of working on the floor each night, I mean, people, physically working, mentally, they get all strung up. So there was a lot of, yelling and, kind of stuff like that. So it was just kind of interesting when you're talking about the grievances and like how things don't really ever really get better. They just stack up because nothing really got better at UPS. I'm pretty sure all these claims and grievances just stacked up and HR just kind of just checked them off as they went, but nothing really ever changed. So I go back there every season and I still know both of the floor managers there and everything. And there are a lot of great guys there, but it was just one of those tensions that you would often see. And almost like once a week, I'd see someone get into a fight with someone. And it's just kind of like, well, Then,
Well,
so.
what you're raising is one of the, first of all, anybody that's in a union or in a factory or in UPS, as you say, you've got these tensions between different levels of workers. One of the big fights in building interracial solidarity are things like how you handle seniority within whole plants versus departments that can build up resentments. So that's an ongoing struggle. And it kind of speaks to just the larger struggle that we have in building any kind of working class organization, is you have, and anybody that's done, like if you any people here were doing canvassing for Bernie or whatever, American workers, instead of, if they're not getting as much as another worker, instead of saying, why shouldn't I get as much as they are? That's what would be the fairest, have been so encouraged and so taught over decades by the voices of management and elites that, if he's making more than you, you should resent that person rather than recognizing that you should get as much at least as they are, and you both probably should get more. So fighting those battles within unions to build that kind of all-encompassing solidarity, so you're not fighting with each other, but you're recognizing that the enemy is the person who employs you, not the worker next to you who might be making a little bit more, who you think has an easier time of it, is an ongoing challenge for any union leader, and certainly for those frontline people, the stewards and the committeemen, et cetera. And it's really tough. But but you have to be preaching again that the 2 or 3 or 4 workers who are squabbling amongst each other are missing the larger picture of what's going on here. And certainly I would hope that if it's in a situation where you've got a union worker or a group of union workers who are doing better than workers who don't have a union, that we would want to try to encourage those workers to recognize that the reason that they're not getting as much money and that they have to work harder is because they don't have a union. So I'd hope those people in the union would try to frame the argument that way. But it's, it's easy for us historians to sort of talk about what should happen and how solidarity is supposed to work, and on the job it can be a lot more challenging. But I think it's also, we're fighting against kind of a mentality that has encouraged workers to see other workers, Black workers, women, ethnic workers, as immigrants, as the enemy, as opposed to the people who are benefiting from that kind of division. So, and it happens at the micro level, like you're talking about as well.
I think you hit it on the head. It's kind of ironic that we would always fight amongst each other. Like the loaders would fight the drivers and so on and so forth. But like you said, no one would ever really go to UPS. They would always kind of circly squabble around each other. Yeah. I always thought that was ironic. I was like, well, you guys could always just go to, collectively go to UPS.
it speaks to that larger battle for sort of, who gets to sort of set the historical record, right? And, who sort of has narrative control in those situations. And I think, what we see through your book is, the fact that, yes, it does, the opportunity for, radical change in how we sort of structure society and how we structure our workplaces exists. The fact of the matter that it's been written out of many history books, is part of the process, right? That kind of like that forced erasure of, our shared radical past. So I think, again, not to spoil anything in the book, read this book, got very excited. Even though the book is a history, it makes me very excited about our future, and the evolution of the labor movement after COVID. So I just wanted to, again, thank you so much for zooming in and sharing your work and your experience and your expertise with us. This is it's a fantastic book, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm glad so many people managed to turn out. So if you're still in the Zoom, join me in giving Toni a round of digital applause. Excellent. And to the question of, we will be archiving this conversation. So if you, we'll be adding it to our YouTube page, which will probably be about a week in terms of the turnaround. But yeah, if you want to, I mean, again, this is work that I think needs to be shared. So please, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you sort of pay it forward to your friends and families.
And I want to really thank everyone again for being here. It's late where I am, and some of you are probably out here as well, and a day when people were distracted by lots of other stuff. So people who tuned in, and let me just again emphasize that, you know, that this fighting against this notion of individual competitiveness, of individual initiative, that's what makes America great, is something that I think labor historians are fighting against all the time. And the examples are rife within our actual history. And Jim Williams knows them personally, and Zach does, fighting on the waterfront, and that it's not individual initiative that gets workers what they need, and it's that communal spirit and sense of community that not just makes their working lives better, but that makes their, you know, spiritual lives, if I could say that, better. That makes them it makes, you know, living in this country and going to work pleasant rather than tedious. So anyway, I'm really want to thank again Alex and the University of Washington Tacoma, and everybody for joining in. And I hope that you'll join me next month and we can have this conversation in greater depth.